Allow me to start, given that this is our closing event, with a note of thanks to all our project partners with whom we, I think, have worked for 3 years in a very fruitful and cooperative manner, especially to Southeast European Research Center for coordinating our project work. Allow me also to start by thanking my assistants during this process, Nuve Yazgan and Deniz Erdem, who assisted me in conducting interviews in Istanbul, in Ankara, and in Izmir, and which allowed us to bring together the results which I will present to you today. So, as Alexandra mentioned, I work in Turkey, and our leg of the project was about European integration, which in the Turkish case means EU-Turkey relations, and the effect that the migration and refugee crisis has had. And I want to start by giving you the sort of overview of what happened in this relationship. Now, many of you will be aware of the fact that relations between Turkey and the EU had been steadily deteriorating almost immediately after accession negotiations began in 2005. So much so that by the time that the crisis actually hit Europe, it had hit Turkey much earlier. Quite paradoxically, the crisis became one of the very few points in which Turkey and the European Union were able to cooperate. And of course, the recent escalation of tensions in northern Syria is now bringing this increasingly into doubt. However, it is important to keep in mind that the EU and Turkey became locked into a relationship out of which what emerged was, of course, the famous EU-Turkey deal, which to this day, until now, still constitutes the basis upon which Europe is trying to manage the flow of migrants and or refugees coming into its territory. One of the major findings, if you want to call them this way, is that the relationship between Turkey and the EU has now acquired what we call a transactional character. So Turkey is formally, officially a candidate state for membership, still, and that is because none of the two, neither Turkey nor the European Union, has taken a step back to stop that relationship from existing. However, this is not a typical case of a country that continues to aspire to full EU membership, or indeed of a European Union that wishes to encourage it to move to that direction. And so by transactional character, what I mean is we have a so-called interest-based relationship in which, to the extent that the interests of the Turkish state and the European Union as a whole come close enough to be aligned, then there is a formal cooperation, witness the EU-Turkey deal. When this doesn't happen, the relationship deteriorates quite rapidly. The EU-Turkey deal, as I say, demonstrates this kind of character of the relationship, and I think there is a lot more sort of detail which I need to add in order to explain the position that I hold on this. One last thing about the incursion in Syria, because it's not strictly related to our project, but it's very timely. My explanation for this is, as you can see there on the last bullet point, twofold. On the one hand, I think the incursion shows some of the challenges that the Turkish authorities are now facing domestically. So this is an attempt to almost export parts of the crisis that Turkey is facing within it, both economically and politically, to Syria. And secondly, it also reveals, of course, the relevance of Europe as a foreign policy actor, but we can talk about this later on. Okay, let me just give you a bit of context about the particular case of Turkey and the crisis. You can see some numbers there. Let me start from the basic one. For Europe and for our project, the migration and refugee crisis became a crisis, and that's why I had it in quotation marks, if you noticed on the headline, in 2015, 2016. Turkey started receiving the first wave of Syrian refugees a few months, or a few weeks, in fact, in the spring of 2011, when Bashar al-Assad decided to suppress the opposition and the dissident groups in Syria. This is the moment when the first Syrian refugees started trying to cross the border. And what was the reaction of the Turkish state? The reaction of the Turkish state was extremely welcoming, in the sense that for a very long period of time, essentially until 2016, when the terrorist attacks hit major Turkish cities, Turkey was following a so-called open arms policy. The idea was let them come in, let them take refuge from a dictatorial regime with which President Erdogan had split by that time. They used to be best friends until 2009, then things changed. and Syria and Turkey, the Syrian regime and the Turkish Authority, squared off. So today we have a situation in which more than 4 million Syrians live in Turkey. The population ratio is about 1 to 20. Turkey is by far the country that has suffered the worst consequences of the crisis, full stop. There is no way going about this. The largest city, and you can see this on the map, number 1, hosting currently Syrians is Istanbul. There are more than 500,000 Syrian refugees there at the moment. The vast majority of the rest of the Syrians dispersed in the country are on the border region with Syria, of course. That is to say, Urfa, Hatay, Gaziantep, as well as some of the larger metropolitan areas on the west, namely Bursa and Izmir. The total number, as I say, is more than 4 million. The official number we're given from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is about 3.7. Informally, there should be more than 5 million Syrians in the country at the moment. So population 80 million, 81 million Syrians and others, Afghanis, Iraqis, and so more than 5 million people. Just a quick note on how Turkey was or was not prepared to deal with this. Here what you have is a series of details to which I will not get into in terms of the policy that was followed by Turkey. The main takeaway from this is, from the establishment of the Turkish Republic, there was a very restrictive policy on migrants and refugees. Turkey was a signatory to the major international conventions, but in essence never recognized the right of following the sort of typical policy on migrants that was espoused by international organizations. That's why you have the so-called geographical limitation on the second bullet point over there, in which, in essence, Turkey was willing to offer asylum only to Europeans, only to those coming from the West rather than the East, which, of course, quickly, by the end of the Cold War and when the first Gulf War erupted, became a policy that was unsustainable. So the key point here is not so much the asylum regulation of 1994 that you see there, but the laws implemented following the first wave of Syrians coming in that I mentioned at the beginning. So in 2013, we have the Law on International Protection, sponsored and assisted by the United Nations and the European Union in close cooperation with the Turkish authorities, which started changing the understanding of the Turkish state as to who constitutes a migrant. Now the idea was that migration should not be any more limited to people of quote-unquote Turkish descent, a policy that goes back to the 30s. We had the establishment of what appears to be a rather effective General Directorate of Migration Management that coordinated the rather dispersed policies followed until then by the Turkish state. And following on the peak of the crisis in 2014, 2015, the Turkish state also moved further by way of facilitating the possibility of employment for Syrian refugees, offering them biometric ID cards, trying to register them, trying in essence to sort out what appeared to be a very messy situation. The problem, of course, is, and that is linked to events in Syria at the moment, that there is no design on the part of the Turkish state for those people to settle permanently in Turkey, although we do know from data available that the vast majority of Syrians who now live in Turkey wish to continue living there. Many of them have set up shop, many of them have set up businesses, particularly small entrepreneurs are very active in the major cities, especially in Istanbul. Their children, many of whom are being born in Turkey, see themselves and their future in Turkey. But, and that is another point that I wish to stress, there is by now a very large popular backlash against what many Turkish people consider to be a situation that has reached its limits. The idea now is we can't do this anymore, we can't continue hosting them, particularly in times of economic crisis. They need to go back, or at least many of them need to go back. A discourse which is, I think, completely similar or parallel to what happens elsewhere in Europe, and this is also one of the main motivations for President Erdogan's declaration, let's say, I'm not sure it can be materialized, that the so-called safety zone that the Turkish army wishes to impose in northern Syria will host 2 million of the 4 million Syrians who now live in Turkey. And so this is a reflection of what's happening in the country at the moment. In terms of the EU, it has played a very positive role in bringing about the changes that you see here. It has actually motivated the Turkish state. Cooperation between the two was very successful for a long time, and therefore Turkey and the EU were managing this together up to a point, and I'll come back to this later on. Of course, what Turkey has claimed, and not entirely without justification, is that it has had to bear most of the financial and administrative burden of dealing with millions of people, and it has been complaining for a long time about the unwillingness, if you like, of Western powers in particular to assist it in the process. So the argument has been that Jordan and Lebanon have disproportionately benefited from international assistance, whereas at least until the EU-Turkey deal, Turkey was basically left on its own devices to deal with the problem. So if we want to bring all of this together, we now have a situation in which cooperation between international organizations, including the EU and the Turkish state, following the reforms I discussed before, have allowed for some form of transitioning to a system in which, for instance, as you can see there, about 2/3 of school-age Syrian children are now enrolled in schools. We have very many logistical problems there. Many of them obviously are not fluent in Turkish. They only hear Arabic at home. There is an attempt to try and create dual language school courses, but this is extremely difficult given the administrative resources one would need to actually accomplish it, and I don't think there is necessarily the political will to do so any longer either. And in that sense, many important problems remain. Employment is another example. Now it is formally allowed. The problem there, and we have had this in Europe elsewhere in the past, particularly with enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, is the so-called wage dumping effect. In essence, very few of the Syrians who work in Turkey are registered workers, which means that their employer needs to pay their social security contributions, which are quite heavy in Turkey, and therefore what happens is they're able to undercut the minimum wage, which is set nationally, and therefore for Turkish employers it is much cheaper and therefore much easier to use and exploit cheap Syrian labor at the cost of Turkish workers, which of course then leads to a whole series of phenomena we are familiar with, such as the attempt to scapegoat Syrians for rising unemployment, and therefore leads to clashes and conflict, particularly in the large cities where many Syrians tend to be concentrated. So what I do in another part of this paper is talk a little bit about the relations more generally. Here I only want to point out to one phenomenon, and that is that, as I said at the beginning, almost immediately after the start of accession negotiations, relations between the EU and Turkey got derailed, which is quite phenomenal if you consider the history of enlargement. Usually when you start accession negotiations, the idea is you pick up momentum and things improve. The exact opposite happened in the Turkish case, and of course we have the obvious reason, which is the Cyprus imbroglio between Turkey, Cyprus and the European Union, but we also have, of course, the ascendancy of what we call identity politics over political and economic concerns. So the accession negotiations began at a particular moment in time when a progressive center-left majority in the European Council decided to treat Turkey as a normal country, quote unquote, that is to say, apply the Copenhagen enlargement criteria without taking into account identity politics. And very soon, conservative political forces such as Angela Merkel in Germany or Nicolas Sarkozy in France made it clear that this is a different case. This is a country over which we will need to do much more to eventually, if ever, integrate it. Things got derailed, and as we saw yesterday with regard to the decision of the Council on North Macedonia and Albania, the same mentality in Europe, that is to say, stopping enlargement at all costs, still appears to be quite important. And attempts by the European Commission during this period of crisis in 2012 to revive relations through the so-called positive agenda got nowhere. Turkey started feeling very much isolated. They adopted this so-called double standards thesis, essentially saying they don't want us because we're Muslim, disregarding the political and economic record of the country, and things went down from there. I'm not going to say more about the EU-Turkey deal, possibly because my colleagues are going to discuss it in more detail. I don't want to give you too many numbers. The essential point here is that the deal stands. It seems to be working certainly for Europe. I'm not so sure it works for Turkey any longer. The fundamental point behind it is, and that's where I want to concentrate, Europe made a decision when it signed the deal. And the decision was, we are going to link the deal and the willingness of the then Turkish government to assist us in essentially keeping migrants and refugees in their territory with Turkey's deteriorating EU accession prospect. In other words, part of the deal, often not very discussed in Europe, was the idea that we're going to open more chapters for accession negotiations, one of them opened, and crucially, and that's the most important part for Turkey, we are going to facilitate the so-called visa liberalization regime. For Turkey, the big point, and for its leadership, excuse me, is not accession per se. The big prize is visa liberalization, allowing the Turkish people to travel to Europe. And when that came on the table, the proposition became very attractive for President Erdogan. Of course, there was a series of benchmarks that had to be fulfilled, and the reason why we haven't had the visa liberalization regime until now essentially relates to developments within Turkey since the aborted coup attempt of 2016, which has led to massive institutional and political change, an over-concentration of power in the hands of the president, and of course the unwillingness on the part of the Turkish state to fulfill the key condition for visa liberalization, namely to reform the anti-terrorism law and make sure that the definition of terrorism would be more circumscribed and more limited than the one that Turkey has essentially adopted. So, in a way, what we observe through the EU-Turkey deal and developments within Turkey is that, on the one hand, Europe seeks to adopt a very transactional character in the way that it treats Turkey. There are the complaints about democratic standard deterioration, the backsliding that we have been observing. And yet, on the other, realizing how crucial this deal is, particularly for the European electorate, we have a generous financial policy and also politically a willingness to re-engage with a government that a number of times has been condemned by the same European institutions for the sort of policies that it follows. And so, as I said, I don't want to take too much time, and I'm happy to answer questions later on with regard to the consequences of the crisis for both Turkey and Europe. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is the domestic political developments in Turkey following the peak of the migration and refugee crisis have, on the one hand, led to a necessary form of cooperation with Europe, which wasn't necessarily on the cards. But Turkey was very quick, and in that sense right, to recognize the vulnerability of the European political elite, which became almost completely dependent on Turkish willingness to cooperate with it. And so, at the moment of signing the EU-Turkey deal, the idea was that this is going to allow for a steady improvement in relations, but as ever in Turkey, so many events happen so quickly, it's very difficult to follow, that the coup attempt of 2016 has undermined this logic almost entirely. Finally, domestically with regard to Turkey, and aside from the EU-Turkey relationship, I want to stress again how important the backlash against the Syrian refugees now is. Particularly the opposition to the governing Justice and Development Party made this almost its flagship policy, accusing President Erdogan of not following a coherent policy with regard to the migrants and the refugees. And that is one of the fundamental reasons behind the victory of the opposition in the local elections that recently took place in Turkey, including, of course, Istanbul. And as President Erdogan had said many years ago, whoever wins Istanbul wins Turkey. And that's why we are now entering a period, I think, of potentially important political transformation within Turkey itself. Thank you for your attention.